The midnight train whistle woke Rose Lockhart with a jolt, the sound fading into the vast Montana territory as she clutched her velvet reticule tighter, her heart pounding with each passing moment. This was not how her life was supposed to unfold, sleeping in an abandoned wagon miles from civilization, her silk traveling dress mudded and torn, her once pristine gloves now frayed at the fingers. The year was 1879, and Rose had fled the only home she'd ever known, a sprawling Boston mansion with marble columns and servants who anticipated her every need. Now, at 22, she found herself utterly alone beneath a star-strewn sky that seemed both terrifying and magnificent in its vastness. Rose shivered, pulling the threadbare blanket she'd found in the wagon closer around her shoulders. 3 days ago, she had been Rose Lockhart, heiress to the Lockhart Railroad fortune, begrudgingly preparing for her wedding to Senator Harold Weatherby, a man 40 years her senior with cold eyes and colder hands. The marriage had been her father's final decree before his unexpected death last winter. She would marry the senator to secure the family's political connections or be disinherited entirely. So she ran. With only her mother's jewels sewn into the hem of her dress, and whatever money she could gather on short notice, Rose had boarded a train west, changing her route several times to evade the private detectives her stepmother would surely send after her. Her journey had led her to this remote stretch of Montana territory, where the stagecoach she'd been traveling on had been held up by bandits the previous day. While the other passengers had been robbed of their valuables, Rose had slipped away in the confusion, running blindly through unfamiliar terrain until her legs gave out. Providence had led her to this abandoned wagon, partially sheltered by a rocky overhang, its wooden frame weathered but sound enough to keep out the elements. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with pursuing shadows and her stepmother's mocking laughter. When she woke again, dawn was breaking over the distant mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Rose sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs, and peered cautiously out from the wagon. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent panic shooting through her veins. She scrambled deeper into the wagon, wedging herself behind a broken crate. Had they found her already? Would she be dragged back to Boston in disgrace? The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped altogether. Heavy boots crunched on the gravelly soil outside. Rose held her breath, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle any sound. "Hello," a deep voice called, its timbre low and resonant. "Anybody in there?" Rose remained silent, her eyes wide with fear. The footsteps grew closer and a shadow fell across the wagon's entrance. Then a man appeared, silhouetted against the morning light. She could make out broad shoulders, a cowboy hat, and what appeared to be a rifle slung across his back. "I know someone's in here," he said, his voice gentler now. "Saw the tracks leading this way. I'm not looking to cause trouble." When Rose still didn't respond, he took a cautious step forward, then paused as he spotted her huddled form. Instead of advancing further, he crouched down, setting his rifle carefully on the ground beside him. "You're safe now," he whispered, the kindness in his voice making tears spring to her eyes. "Nobody's going to hurt you." In the growing light, Rose could see his face more clearly, tanned from the sun, with strong features and eyes the color of the Montana sky. He wasn't much older than she was, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair curling from beneath his hat. "Are you with the law?" Rose asked, her voice hoarse from disuse and fear. A slight smile crossed his face. "No, madam, just a rancher. My land starts about 2 miles east of here." "Name's Vaughn, Zachariah." Rose hesitated, weighing her options. This man could be lying. He could be a bounty hunter sent to track her down, but something in his steady gaze made her want to trust him. "I'm Rose," she said finally, omitting her surname. "I was separated from my traveling party." Vaughn nodded, not pressing for details. "You're a long way from anywhere, Miss Rose. Nearest town is Willow Creek, good 15 miles from here." "I had intended to reach there," she admitted, slowly emerging from her hiding place. Vaughn's eyes widened slightly as he took in her appearance. The quality of her clothing, despite its current state, marked her as someone of means. But he made no comment on it. "My ranch isn't far," he said instead. "You're welcome to rest there, get cleaned up. My housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, can help you get situated. Then I can take you to town, if that's where you're headed." Rose hesitated. Going with this stranger seemed dangerous, but staying alone in the wilderness was certainly more so. And something about Vaughn Zachariah's straightforward manner inspired trust. I would be grateful for your assistance, Mr. Zachariah." "Just Vaughn, please," he said, offering her his hand. When Rose tried to stand, her legs nearly gave way beneath her. Without comment, Vaughn steadied her with a strong hand on her arm. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Yesterday morning," Rose admitted. "I had some crackers." Vaughn reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "It's not much, just some jerky and hardtack, but it'll keep you going until we reach the ranch." The food was nothing like the delicate pastries and poached eggs Rose was accustomed to, but hunger made it taste better than any meal she'd had at her father's table. As she ate, Vaughn moved a respectful distance away, tending to his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion with a white blaze down its face. "This is Thunder," he said when he caught her looking. "Best horse in the territory." "He's beautiful," Rose said sincerely. Vaughn's face softened with pride. "Can you ride? It's not far, but—" Rose nodded. Her father had insisted on riding lessons from the time she was 6, believing it a necessary accomplishment for a young lady of society. "I can manage, good. We'll take it slow." He helped her onto Thunder, then swung up behind her. Rose tensed at the proximity, unaccustomed to such closeness with a man. In Boston, even her dance partners maintained a proper distance, and here she was, pressed against a stranger's chest as they rode across the open range. But as they set off, Rose found herself relaxing incrementally. Vaughn was careful to maintain a respectful posture, and his solid presence behind her was reassuring rather than threatening. The vast landscape opened up before them, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush, distant mountains rising purple against the horizon, and a sky so wide and blue it seemed to encompass the whole world. "It's magnificent," Rose whispered, almost to herself. "You're not from around here," Vaughn observed, not a question but a statement. "No," she agreed. "I'm from Boston." "Long way from home," he commented with no judgment in his voice. Rose didn't respond and Vaughn didn't press further. They rode in companionable silence, broken only by Vaughn occasionally pointing out landmarks or naming the wildflowers that dotted the prairie. As they crested a gentle rise, a sprawling ranch came into view in the valley below. A sturdy 2-story house stood at the center, surrounded by various outbuildings and corrals. Cattle grazed in the distance, and smoke rose from the chimney of the main house. "Welcome to the Triple Z," Vaughn said, a note of pride in his voice. "It's not fancy, but it's home." To Rose, accustomed to the opulence of Boston society, the ranch appeared rustic but undeniably appealing. There was something honest about its simple lines and sturdy construction, a stark contrast to the ornate facades that often concealed the emptiness within her social circle's mansions. As they approached, a woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She was in her 50s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Vaughn, Zachariah, who have you brought home this time?" she called, her tone both scolding and affectionate. "Mrs. Fletcher, this is Miss Rose," Vaughn said as he dismounted, then helped Rose down from the horse. "She had some trouble on the road. I found her sheltering in Old Man Johnson's abandoned wagon." Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened as she took in Rose's bedraggled appearance. "Poor thing. Come inside, dear. We'll get you cleaned up and fed properly." Rose glanced at Vaughn, who nodded encouragingly. "Mrs. Fletcher runs this place. I just pay the bills," he said with a smile. "You're in good hands." Inside, the ranch house was simple but comfortable, with sturdy furniture and homey touches that spoke of care rather than pretension. Mrs. Fletcher led Rose to a small but clean bedroom at the back of the house. "This was Vaughn's sister's room," she explained, pulling fresh linens from a chest. "She's married now, lives over in Helena with her husband and their little ones. I keep it ready for when she visits." Rose looked around at the simple furnishings: a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a plain dresser, and a small mirror on the wall. A far cry from her canopied bed and French vanity in Boston, but there was something undeniably welcoming about the space. "The bathroom's down the hall," Mrs. Fletcher continued. "I'll draw you a bath. Those clothes look like they've seen better days. I might have something that'll fit you in the meantime." "You're very kind," Rose said, emotion making her voice tremble slightly. After days of fear and uncertainty, the simple kindness of these strangers was almost overwhelming. Mrs. Fletcher patted her hand. "Nonsense. Just doing what any decent person would. Now you get cleaned up, and I'll have some food ready when you're done." The hot bath was heavenly, washing away days of grime and fear. Mrs. Fletcher had provided a simple cotton dress that, while a bit large, was clean and comfortable. When Rose emerged, feeling more human than she had in days, she found a hearty meal waiting at the kitchen table: roast beef, potatoes, and fresh baked bread that put even her family's French chef to shame. Vaughn joined them, freshly washed himself, his dark hair still damp. He'd changed into a clean shirt, and Rose couldn't help noticing how it stretched across his broad shoulders. He caught her looking and gave her a small smile that made her cheeks heat unexpectedly. "Feel better?" he asked, passing her the bread basket. "Immensely," Rose admitted. "I can't thank you both enough." "No need for thanks," Vaughn said easily. Anyone would have done the same, but Rose wasn't so sure. In her experience, people rarely helped others without expecting something in return. As they ate, Vaughn explained more about the ranch. "My father started it with just 50 head of cattle and a dream. Built it up to one of the most successful operations in the territory before he passed on 5 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," Rose said sincerely. Vaughn nodded his thanks. "It was hard, but he taught me everything I know about ranching. Left the place to me and my sister, though she was never much interested in the cattle business. Preferred books and learning. She's a school teacher now." "And a fine one," Mrs. Fletcher interjected proudly. "Taught half the children in Helena, she has." "You must be proud of her," Rose said. "Very," Vaughn agreed. "Now, I don't mean to pry, but I'm guessing there's a reason you were hiding out in that abandoned wagon instead of traveling properly." Rose stiffened, setting down her fork. "You don't have to tell us," he added quickly. "But if you're in some kind of trouble, maybe we can help." Rose looked between their kind, open faces and felt a sudden, overwhelming desire to unburden herself. These people had shown her nothing but kindness. Perhaps they deserved some honesty in return. "I'm running away," she admitted softly. "From an arranged marriage to a man I could never love." Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened with understanding, while Vaughn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father died last winter," Rose continued, the words coming easier now. His will stipulated that I marry Senator Weatherby to secure our family's interests. If I refused, I would be disinherited. So you chose freedom over fortune, Vaughn said, a note of respect in his voice. I suppose I did, Rose agreed. Though I've never been without money before, I'm afraid I'm woefully unprepared for life on my own. Where were you headed? Mrs. Fletcher asked gently. I'm not entirely sure, Rose admitted. West, away from Boston. I thought perhaps California. I have a distant cousin in San Francisco who might take me in, at least until I can establish myself somehow. Vaughn nodded thoughtfully. Willow Creek has a stage that connects to the railroad at Fort Benton. From there, you could make your way to California easily enough. But not tomorrow, Mrs. Fletcher said firmly. The poor girl needs rest first. Of course, Vaughn agreed quickly. No rush, Miss Rose. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. Relief washed over Rose. A few days' respite before continuing her journey would be a blessing. Thank you. I promise I won't impose for long. Nonsense, Mrs. Fletcher scoffed. It's nice having another woman around the place. These cowboys aren't much for conversation about anything but cattle and horses. Vaughn laughed, a warm sound that made Rose smile despite herself. She's not wrong, he admitted. After dinner, Rose found herself on the front porch with Vaughn, watching as the sunset painted the vast Montana sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains and the earthy smell of cattle and horses. It's beautiful here, Rose said softly. So different from Boston. Too different, Vaughn asked, glancing at her profile. Rose considered this. No, she said finally. Just different. In Boston, everything feels confined, restricted. There are so many rules about what a lady can and cannot do, who she can speak to, how she must behave. Out here, the very air feels freer somehow. Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's why my father came west, said the East was too crowded with people and expectations. Wanted a place where a man was judged by his actions, not his family name or bank account. A wise man, Rose murmured. He was, Vaughn agreed. Would have liked you, I think. Rose turned to him, surprised. Why do you say that? Takes courage to leave everything you know, strike out on your own. He admired courage above all else. The simple compliment warmed Rose more than she expected. In Boston, she was praised for her beauty, her accomplishments on the pianoforte, her fluency in French, never for courage. Tell me about your ranch, she said, eager to learn more about this life so different from her own. Vaughn's face lit up as he spoke about the Triple Z, the challenges of the harsh winters, the joy of spring calving season, the endless work that somehow never felt like a burden because it was his. Rose listened, entranced by his passion and the obvious love he had for this land. I'm boring you, he said eventually, looking embarrassed. Not at all, Rose assured him. It's refreshing to hear someone speak so earnestly about something they love. Vaughn studied her face in the fading light. What do you love, Miss Rose? The question caught her off guard. What did she love? In Boston, her days had been filled with social calls, charity committees, and endless fittings for new gowns, none of which had brought her any real joy. I love to read, she said finally. Adventure stories, mostly. Tales of far-off places and brave explorers. She smiled self-consciously. Childish, I know. Not childish at all, Vaughn disagreed. We have quite a collection of books inside. My sister's influence. You're welcome to them while you're here. Thank you, Rose said, genuinely pleased. And what about you? Besides the ranch, what do you love? Vaughn thought for a moment. Thunderstorms, he said finally. The way the whole world seems to hold its breath before the rain comes. The smell of the air, the power of it. He looked almost embarrassed by the admission. And sunrises, worth getting up early for every time. Rose smiled, charmed by his unexpected poetry. This cowboy was full of surprises. As darkness fell completely, they reluctantly went inside. Rose found herself exhausted despite the relatively early hour, the events of the past few days catching up with her at last. She bid Vaughn and Mrs. Fletcher good night and retired to the small bedroom, where she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time since leaving Boston. The next morning, Rose woke to sunlight streaming through the simple curtains and the smell of coffee and bacon wafting from the kitchen. For a moment, she was disoriented, expecting to see the damask wallpaper of her Boston bedroom. Then memory returned, and with it a surprising sense of relief. She dressed in the borrowed clothes Mrs. Fletcher had provided, a simple skirt and shirtwaist that were practical if not fashionable, and made her way to the kitchen, where she found the housekeeper already busy at the stove. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Fletcher greeted her cheerfully. "Sleep well, better than I have in weeks," Rose admitted, accepting a cup of strong black coffee with gratitude. "Vaughn's already out with the men," Mrs. Fletcher explained, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before Rose. "They're moving the herd to the north pasture today. Hard work, that." Rose ate hungrily, realizing she couldn't remember the last time food had tasted so good. In Boston, meals had been elaborate affairs with multiple courses, each more ornate than the last, but she'd often picked at her food, too corseted and too anxious to enjoy it properly. "Is there anything I can help with?" Rose asked when she'd finished, feeling awkward about sitting idle while Mrs. Fletcher worked. The older woman looked surprised, then pleased. "Well, I wouldn't say no to help with the bread if you've a mind to learn. Though I suspect it's not the sort of thing Boston heiresses typically concern themselves with." Rose blushed. "You figured that out, did you?" Mrs. Fletcher chuckled. "Wasn't hard, dear. Your accent, those fine hands that have never seen hard work, the quality of that dress you arrived in despite its condition. But don't worry, your secret's safe with me, and with Vaughn." "Thank you," Rose said, relieved. "And yes, I'd very much like to learn about bread making. I've never been allowed in a kitchen before." "Never allowed? Mercy me, what a thought. Well, come on then. First thing to know is bread's like a living thing, needs the right conditions to grow, needs gentle handling, and above all needs patience." The morning passed pleasantly as Mrs. Fletcher taught Rose the basics of bread making. Rose's first attempts at kneading were clumsy, but she found unexpected satisfaction in the physical work. The way the dough transformed beneath her hands from a sticky mass to a smooth, elastic ball. "You've a natural touch," Mrs. Fletcher approved as Rose shaped her first loaf. "Some people never get the feel for it, but you've got it straight away." Pride swelled in Rose's chest at the simple compliment, so different from the hollow praise she received in Boston for mastering the latest complicated dance steps or memorizing French poetry. After the bread was set to rise, Mrs. Fletcher showed Rose around the rest of the house: the cozy sitting room with its well-stocked bookshelf, the dining room where the ranch hands ate their meals, and Vaughn's study, a small room lined with ledgers and maps of the property. "He works too hard," Mrs. Fletcher confided. "Has ever since his father passed, feels the responsibility of the whole place on his shoulders." "Doesn't he have help?" Rose asked. "I thought I heard mention of ranch hands." "Oh, he has a good crew, loyal men who'd ride through fire for him. But Vaughn's the kind who leads from the front. Won't ask a man to do anything he wouldn't do himself. His father was the same way." Rose thought about the men her father had associated with in Boston, wealthy industrialists and politicians who would never dream of working alongside their employees. Vaughn's approach seemed far more honorable. In the afternoon, after the bread had been baked, filling the house with a mouth-watering aroma that made Rose's stomach growl despite the substantial lunch Mrs. Fletcher had provided. Rose found herself drawn to the bookshelf in the sitting room. True to Vaughn's word, it held a diverse collection novels by Dickens and Austen, volumes of poetry, and best of all, adventure tales by authors like Jules Verne and James Fenimore Cooper. She selected 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and settled into a comfortable armchair by the window, soon losing herself in the underwater adventures of Captain Nemo. The afternoon passed swiftly, and Rose was startled when the front door opened, admitting Vaughn, dusty and tired-looking but with a satisfied expression. "Something smells amazing," he said, then noticed Rose with the book. "I see you found the library." Rose held up the volume, slightly embarrassed at having been so engrossed. "It's wonderful. I've wanted to read this for ages, but my stepmother considered Jules Verne inappropriate reading for young ladies." Vaughn's eyebrows rose. "What's inappropriate about submarine adventures?" "They might give a girl ideas," Rose said dryly. "And nothing terrifies Boston society more than a woman with ideas." Vaughn laughed, a rich sound that made Rose smile in response. "Well, out here, ideas are welcome from anyone who has them, man, woman, or child." "Another point in Montana's favor," Rose said lightly. Their eyes met for a moment too long, and Rose felt a strange flutter in her chest. She looked away first, suddenly flustered. "I should help Mrs. Fletcher with dinner," she said, rising from the chair. "You made bread," Vaughn noted, nodding toward the kitchen where the fresh loaves cooled on the counter. "My first attempt," Rose admitted. "Mrs. Fletcher says it turned out well, but she may just be being kind." "She's never kind about bad bread," Vaughn assured her with a grin. "If she said it's good, it's good." Rose found herself unreasonably pleased by this endorsement. "Will you join us for dinner?" "Wouldn't miss it," Vaughn said. "Just need to clean up first. Been chasing ornery cattle all day." As he headed upstairs to wash, Rose returned to the kitchen, where Mrs. Fletcher was already preparing dinner, a savory stew that had been simmering all day, filling the house with rich, enticing aromas. "Can I help?" Rose offered. "You can set the table, dear," Mrs. Fletcher suggested. "Dishes in that cupboard there. Silverware in the drawer beneath." Rose arranged the simple stoneware plates and sturdy silverware on the kitchen table, taking care to place them neatly. Even this mundane task gave her a sense of accomplishment that she rarely felt in Boston, where servants handled every domestic chore. Vaughn returned, his hair damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt that brought out the blue in his eyes. He took a seat at the table, and Mrs. Fletcher served the stew, accompanied by Rose's bread, which had been sliced and buttered. "This looks incredible," Vaughn said appreciatively, taking a hearty bite. "And the bread is perfect, Miss Rose. Sure you've never baked before?" Rose felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "Quite sure. All credit goes to Mrs. Fletcher's excellent instruction." "Nonsense," the housekeeper said, pleased. "You've got a natural touch, that's all. Some do, some don't." The meal was simple but delicious, the conversation easy and unforced. Vaughn told stories about the day's work, the calf that had strayed and led them on a merry chase, the new foal born to one of the mares, the signs that suggested an early, hard winter ahead. "How do you know?" Rose asked, fascinated. "Signs are everywhere if you know how to read them," Vaughn explained. "Thick husks on the corn, heavy fur on the rabbits, squirrels gathering nuts earlier than usual. My father taught me to watch for these things. The land speaks to those who listen." It was so different from Boston, where nature was something to be controlled and contained in carefully manicured gardens and parks. Here, people lived in partnership with the land, respecting its power and wisdom. After dinner, Vaughn surprised Rose by pulling out a well-worn chess set. "Do you play?" he asked, setting up the pieces on a small table by the fire. "I do," Rose said, delighted. Chess had been one of the few pastimes her father had encouraged, believing it developed strategic thinking. "Though I warn you, I'm rather good." Vaughn's eyes lit with competitive amusement. "We'll see about that, Miss Rose." Their first game was closely matched, with Vaughn eventually checkmating Rose's king after a hard-fought battle. The second game swung in Rose's favor when she executed a clever trap that caught Vaughn by surprise. "Well played," he conceded, studying her with new respect. "Where did you learn to play like that, my father?" Rose said, a pang of sadness touching her at the memory. "He was a businessman through and through, always thinking 3 moves ahead. He said chess taught valuable lessons about patience and foresight." "Smart man," Vaughn observed. One more game to break the tie. They played late into the evening, their final game extending far longer than the previous 2 as they grew familiar with each other's strategies. Mrs. Fletcher had long since retired, leaving them alone by the flickering firelight. Rose was acutely aware of Vaughn across the table, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the strong hands that moved the pieces with surprising delicacy, the occasional smile when she made a particularly clever move. She found herself watching him more than the board at times, drawn to the quiet intensity of his focus. When she finally checkmated his king, Vaughn laughed softly, shaking his head in admiration. "You're a formidable opponent, Miss Rose. I concede defeat gracefully." "Thank you for the games," Rose said, reluctant for the evening to end. "It's been a long time since I've enjoyed chess so much." Vaughn began putting the pieces away, his fingers brushing hers occasionally as they worked together. Each small contact sent a ripple of awareness through Rose, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. "Tomorrow," Vaughn said as they finished, "would you like to see more of the ranch? I could saddle a gentle mare for you, show you around the property." The offer filled Rose with unexpected delight. "I'd love that," she said honestly. Vaughn smiled, the firelight casting warm shadows across his face. "Good, we'll go after breakfast if that suits." "Perfect," Rose agreed, then stifled a yawn. "I've kept you up too late," Vaughn said apologetically. "You must still be tired from your ordeal." "It was worth it," Rose assured him, rising from her chair. "Good night, Vaughn." "Good night, Miss Rose," he replied softly. "Sleep well." As Rose made her way to her borrowed bedroom, she found herself smiling. For the first time since fleeing Boston, she wasn't thinking about what she'd left behind, but rather what might lie ahead. The morning dawned clear and crisp, with a hint of autumn in the air despite it being only late August. Rose dressed in the riding clothes. Mrs. Fletcher had somehow produced a divided skirt and sturdy blouse that were practical if not fashionable, and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Vaughn already at the table, nursing a cup of coffee. "Good morning," he greeted her, his eyes warming as he took in her appearance. "You look ready for a day in the saddle." "I hope so," Rose said, accepting the coffee Mrs. Fletcher poured for her. "It's been some time since I've ridden properly." In Boston, ladies only ride in the park at a sedate pace and always side saddle. Vaughn looked horrified at the thought. "Side saddle, out here. You'd be thrown in 5 minutes flat." "Hence the divided skirt," Rose said, gesturing to the practical garment. "Mrs. Fletcher assures me it's quite respectable for riding in the West." "Absolutely," Vaughn agreed. "Function over fashion when you're working cattle country." After a hearty breakfast of flapjacks and bacon, they made their way to the stables, where Vaughn introduced Rose to a pretty bay mare named Daisy. "She's gentle but not sluggish," he explained as he saddled the horse. "Responsive to the lightest touch. I think you'll get along fine." Rose approached the mare, stroking her velvety nose and speaking softly to her. The horse nickered in response, seeming to approve of her new rider. Vaughn helped Rose mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. The casual contact sent a flutter through her stomach that had nothing to do with the prospect of riding. They set off at an easy pace, Vaughn on Thunder and Rose on Daisy, heading away from the ranch buildings toward the open rangeland beyond. The morning was glorious, the sky an impossible blue, the grassland stretching to the horizon in every direction. "It's magnificent," Rose breathed, taking in the vastness of the landscape. "In Boston, you can never see this far. There are always buildings, trees, something blocking the view." "That's what I love about it," Vaughn agreed. "The openness. Feels like you can breathe out here." They rode for an hour, Vaughn pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the land, how his father had bought the first parcel with money saved from years of cowboying for other ranchers, how they'd slowly expanded, adding adjacent properties as they became available, building the Triple Z into one of the most successful ranches in the territory. "Your father sounds like an exceptional man," Rose observed as they paused atop a ridge overlooking a creek where cattle gathered to drink. "He was," Vaughn agreed, his expression softening with memory. "Tough but fair. Expected a lot from me and my sister, but never more than he expected from himself." He glanced at Rose. "What about your father? What kind of man was he?" Rose considered the question carefully. "Complicated," she said finally. "Brilliant in business, ruthless with competitors, but distant as a father. After my mother died when I was 12, he retreated into his work. I think he didn't know how to raise a daughter alone." "Is that why he arranged your marriage? To ensure you'd be taken care of, perhaps," Rose conceded. "Though I suspect it had more to do with consolidating business relationships than concern for my happiness. Senator Weatherby controls key committees that regulate the railroads. Their alliance would have been advantageous. But not for you," Vaughn observed quietly. "No," Rose agreed. "The senator is not. He's not a kind man, and he's old enough to be my grandfather." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "Then you were right to leave," he said firmly. "No one should be forced to marry where they don't love." The simple statement, delivered with such conviction, warmed Rose unexpectedly. In Boston, marriage for love was considered a charming but impractical notion among her social circle. Alliances between families were business arrangements first and foremost. "Is that common thinking out here?" she asked curiously. "Marrying for love," Vaughn shrugged. "Common enough. Life's hard in cattle country. Needs two people who genuinely care for each other to make it work. Besides," he added with a small smile, "what's the point otherwise?" Rose found herself wondering what kind of husband Vaughn would make: steady, honorable, passionate about his land and his work. The thought came unbidden and left her feeling strangely flustered. They continued their ride, descending from the ridge to follow the creek as it wound through a stand of cottonwoods. The trees provided welcome shade, and they dismounted to let the horses drink. "Hungry?" Vaughn asked, reaching into his saddlebag and pulling out a cloth-wrapped package. "Mrs. Fletcher packed us some lunch." They sat on a fallen log beside the creek, unwrapping cold chicken, biscuits, and slices of apple. The simple meal tasted better than any elaborate luncheon Rose had attended in Boston. "Tell me about California," Vaughn said as they ate. "What will you do when you get there?" Rose hesitated. The truth was, she hadn't thought much beyond escape. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "My cousin runs a millinery shop in San Francisco. Perhaps she'll let me work there while I figure things out." "You've never worked before?" It was a question, not a judgment. Rose shook her head. "Ladies of my station don't work. We organize charity events. attend social functions, and learn accomplishments designed to attract suitable husbands. She made a face. It sounds terribly frivolous when I say it aloud. Not frivolous, Vaughn disagreed. Just different from life out here. Though I'm not sure how those skills will translate to millinery work. Neither am I, Rose admitted with a rueful laugh. But I'm willing to learn. I've already mastered bread making after all. Vaughn smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made Rose's heart beat a little faster. That you have. Mrs. Fletcher was singing your praises this morning before you came down, said you have a natural touch with dough. Pride swelled in Rose's chest at the simple compliment. I enjoyed it, she said honestly. There's something satisfying about creating something useful with your own hands. That's ranch life in a nutshell, Vaughn agreed. Everything you do has purpose, consequence. Good or bad, you see the results of your work directly. After they finished eating, they remounted and continued their exploration of the ranch. Vaughn showed her the north pasture where the fattest cattle grazed on the richest grass, the creek that never ran dry even in the hottest summers, the stand of pines that provided shelter during winter storms. As they rode, Rose found herself increasingly drawn to this man who spoke so passionately about his land, who treated his horses and cattle with respectful care, whose quiet strength seemed to emanate from a deep well of character rather than a desire to dominate. They were making their way back toward the ranch house, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grassland, when Thunder suddenly tensed, his ears pricking forward. Vaughn held up a hand, signaling Rose to stop. Something spooked him, he said quietly, scanning the landscape. A moment later, Rose heard it too, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats, approaching fast. Vaughn's expression turned wary as he spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon, moving rapidly toward them. Riders coming, he said, his voice tense. Stay behind me. Fear clutched at Rose's heart. Had they found her already? Had her stepmother's detectives tracked her this far west? As the riders drew closer, however, Vaughn's posture relaxed slightly. It's Hank and Diego, he said, recognizing two of his ranch hands. Something's wrong, though. They're riding too hard. The men galloped up, reining in their lathered horses sharply. Both looked grim, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. Boss, the older one, Hank, said urgently. Trouble at the north boundary. Sullivan's men are cutting our fence again, driving their cattle onto our grazing land. Vaughn's expression hardened. How many men? 4 that we saw, the younger ranch hand, Diego, replied. Armed, they ran us off when we tried to stop them. Vaughn turned to Rose, his face apologetic. I need to handle this. Sullivan's been trying to push his boundaries into our land for months now. Of course, Rose said, though her stomach tightened with anxiety at the mention of armed men. Take Miss Rose back to the ranch, Vaughn instructed Hank. Then gather the rest of the men and meet me at the north boundary. I can come with you, Rose protested, not wanting to be the cause of delay in what was clearly an urgent situation. Vaughn shook his head firmly. This could get dangerous. Sullivan's men don't hesitate to threaten violence. His expression softened slightly. Please, Rose. I need to know you're safe. The genuine concern in his eyes silenced her objections. Be careful, she said instead. Vaughn nodded, then turned to Diego. Let's ride. Rose watched as they galloped away, anxiety churning in her stomach. Is this Sullivan person truly dangerous? She asked Hank as they started toward the ranch at a more moderate pace. The weathered cowboy's expression was grim. Sullivan's the type who takes what he wants and doesn't much care how he gets it. Been trying to drive Vaughn off this land for 2 years now, ever since he realized how valuable the water rights are. Water rights, Hank nodded. That creek we control. It's the only reliable water source for miles in dry years. Sullivan's land is higher up, gets less rainfall. His cattle suffer in drought years while ours stay fat and healthy. And he's willing to resort to violence over this, Rose asked, appalled. Men have killed for less out here, miss, Hank said bluntly. Water's life in cattle country. By the time they reached the ranch, Rose was sick with worry. Mrs. Fletcher took one look at her face and ushered her inside, sitting her down at the kitchen table with a cup of strong tea. Sullivan again? She asked Hank, who nodded grimly before heading back out to join the others. Does this happen often? Rose asked, clutching her teacup for warmth despite the summer heat. Mrs. Fletcher sighed heavily. More often lately. Sullivan's desperate, lost half his herd in last year's drought and the bank's threatening to foreclose. He thinks if he can claim some of our water rights, he might save his ranch. Couldn't Vaughn negotiate with him? Share the water somehow, Vaughn offered, Mrs. Fletcher said, surprising Rose. Proposed a fair arrangement where Sullivan could water his cattle at designated times in exchange for respecting the property boundaries. Sullivan refused, said he wouldn't take charity, that the water should be his by right. Pride, Rose murmured, understanding. She'd seen similar stubbornness in her father's business rivals. Foolish pride, Mrs. Fletcher agreed, and now it might get men hurt or worse. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Rose tried to distract herself by helping Mrs. Fletcher prepare dinner, but her mind kept returning to Vaughn, facing armed men at his property line. The thought of him being injured or worse filled her with a dread that surprised her with its intensity. When had this man, virtually a stranger 3 days ago, come to matter so much to her? The sun was setting when they finally heard horses approaching. Rose rushed to the window, her heart in her throat, then sagged with relief when she saw Vaughn dismounting, apparently unharmed. The other ranch hands were with him, their expressions tired but satisfied. Rose resisted the impulse to run outside to meet him, instead forcing herself to wait in the kitchen with Mrs. Fletcher. When Vaughn entered a few minutes later, she had to curl her hands into fists to keep from throwing her arms around him in relief. "You're all right," she said, unable to keep the emotion from her voice. Vaughn looked surprised, then pleased by her concern. "I'm fine," he assured her. "We all are." "And Sullivan's men?" Mrs. Fletcher asked, already pouring coffee for the returning men. "Gone for now," Vaughn said, accepting the cup gratefully. "We outnumbered them and they backed down, repaired the fence and drove their cattle back onto their own land." "But they'll be back," Hank predicted grimly, taking a seat at the table. "Probably," Vaughn agreed. "But I've sent Diego to town to telegraph the marshal. It's time we had some official intervention." Rose studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes despite his calm demeanor. "You're worried this isn't over," she observed quietly. Vaughn met her gaze, not bothering to deny it. "Sullivan's desperate and desperate men do desperate things, but we'll handle it." He managed a small smile. "I'm sorry our ride was cut short." "Don't be ridiculous," Rose said firmly. "Your ranch was under threat. That takes precedence over showing me the scenery." Vaughn's smile widened, becoming more genuine. "Still, I promised you a proper tour, perhaps tomorrow if things are quiet." "I'd like that," Rose said, warmth spreading through her chest at the thought of another day in his company. Over dinner, the ranch hands regaled Rose with stories of life on the Triple Z cattle drives through blizzards, encounters with bears and mountain lions, the spring when the creek flooded and they had to rescue stranded calves by boat. Their tales painted a picture of a hard but rewarding life, full of challenges but also deep camaraderie and purpose. Rose found herself envying their clear sense of belonging, their obvious pride in their work. In Boston, her days had been filled with meaningless social obligations, her relationships superficial at best. Here, these men risked their lives for each other and for the land they tended. There was something profoundly appealing about the authenticity of their existence. After the ranch hands had retired to their bunkhouse and Mrs. Fletcher to her room, Rose and Vaughn found themselves alone once more, sitting by the fire as they had the night before. "You've been quiet," Vaughn observed, studying her face in the firelight. Rose hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I was thinking about how different your life is from what I've known, how much more real it seems." Vaughn looked surprised. "Real? Most city folk think ranch life is primitive, lacking in refinement." "There's a difference between refinement and meaning," Rose said slowly, working out her thoughts as she spoke. "In Boston, we have every luxury, every convenience, but so much of what we do feels hollow. Here, everything matters. Every decision has consequences. There's a truthfulness to it that I find compelling." Vaughn's expression softened. "I've never thought of it that way. To me, it's just life, the only one I've known or wanted." "You love it here," Rose said, not a question but a statement. "I do," Vaughn agreed simply. "Can't imagine being anywhere else." "That's a gift," Rose told him. "To know exactly where you belong." Their eyes met across the space between them, and Rose felt something shift in the air, a current of understanding, of connection that transcended their different backgrounds. "Where do you belong, Rose?" Vaughn asked softly. The question resonated through her, stirring emotions she hadn't expected. Where did she belong? Not in Boston, certainly, but beyond that, "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never had the freedom to find out." Vaughn nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Freedom's a precious thing. Worth fighting for." "Yes," Rose agreed. "I'm beginning to understand that." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Vaughn stood, breaking the spell. "It's late," he said, his voice slightly rough. "And tomorrow might be another long day." Rose rose as well, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Good night, Vaughn." "Good night, Rose," he replied softly. For a moment she thought he might reach for her hand, but he simply nodded and stepped back, allowing her to pass. As Rose lay in bed that night, sleep eluded her. Her mind kept returning to Vaughn, his quiet strength, his evident passion for his land, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She had known him only 3 days, yet she felt more connected to him than to anyone in Boston. Was it merely gratitude for his rescue? Admiration for a way of life so different from her own? Or something deeper, more profound? Rose turned restlessly, pulling the quilt closer around her shoulders. It was foolish to develop feelings for a Montana rancher when her plan was to continue to California as soon as possible. Wasn't it? But as sleep finally claimed her, Rose found herself wondering if her hasty plans needed reconsideration. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds building on the horizon. Rose found Vaughn on the porch, studying the sky with a frown. "Storm coming?" she asked, joining him at the railing. "Big one from the look of those clouds," he confirmed. "Might have to postpone our ride today." Rose tried to hide her disappointment. "Of course, safety first." Vaughn glanced at her, his expression softening. "We could still show you the ranch, just not on horseback. The barn, the smithy, the corrals, all within walking distance." Rose brightened. "I'd like that." After breakfast, bundled in a coat borrowed from Vaughn's sister, slightly too large but wonderfully warm, Rose followed Vaughn on a tour of the ranch buildings. He showed her the barn first, introducing her to the various horses and explaining each one's temperament and specialties. "This is Pepper," he said, stopping at the stall of a dappled gray mare. "Best cutting horse on the ranch. Can turn on a dime and anticipate a cow's movement before the cow knows which way it's going." Rose stroked the mare's velvety nose. "She's beautiful." "And she knows it," Vaughn said with affection. "Vainest horse I've ever known. Hates getting muddy, would rather go the long way around a puddle than through it." Rose laughed, charmed by the horse's personality and by Vaughn's obvious love for his animals. Each horse had a name, a history, and a place in the ranch's operations, from Thunder, his personal mount, to the steady draft horses that pulled the heavy wagons from the barn. They moved to the smithy, where the ranch's blacksmith was crafting new horseshoes. Rose watched, fascinated, as the burly man transformed raw metal into perfect curves with practiced blows of his hammer. "Miss Rose helped make the bread yesterday," Vaughn told the blacksmith, whose name was Jenkins. "Mrs. Fletcher says she's a natural." Jenkins grinned, his teeth white against his soot-darkened face. "High praise that. Mrs. Fletcher doesn't compliment easy." Rose blushed, pleased by the acknowledgement. "It was my first attempt. Beginner's luck, perhaps, or hidden talent," Vaughn suggested. "City life doesn't always allow people to discover what they're truly good at." The observation struck Rose as profoundly true. How many talents might she possess that had never been nurtured or even discovered because they weren't considered proper accomplishments for a Boston heiress? They continued their tour, visiting the corrals where young horses were being trained, the chicken coop where Mrs. Fletcher collected fresh eggs each morning, and the smokehouse where meat was preserved for the winter months ahead. Throughout it all, Vaughn's knowledge and passion for ranch operations was evident in every explanation, every anecdote. This wasn't just his livelihood, it was his heritage, his identity. As they walked back toward the house, the first fat raindrops began to fall. By the time they reached the porch, the sky had opened completely, rain sheeting down in silvery curtains. "Just in time," Vaughn observed, shaking water from his hat. "That's going to be a gully washer." They stood on the covered porch, watching as the rain transformed the ranch yard into a series of puddles. The sound of it drumming on the roof was oddly soothing, creating a private world where only the two of them existed. "I love storms," Rose admitted, breathing in the clean scent of rain-washed air. "In Boston, they're an inconvenience, ruining garden parties and soaking expensive shoes, but out here they feel elemental, necessary." "They are necessary," Vaughn agreed. "Life-giving." A good rain can mean the difference between profit and loss, between thriving and barely surviving. A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, followed almost immediately by a tremendous crack of thunder. Rose jumped slightly, and Vaughn's hand came to rest reassuringly on her arm. "That was close," he said, his voice low. "Let's go inside." But Rose found herself reluctant to leave the porch, to break the strange intimacy created by the storm's fury. "It's beautiful," she said instead. "Terrifying but beautiful." Vaughn's eyes, when they met hers, held an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "Exactly that." For a moment they stood there, connected by something beyond words. Then Mrs. Fletcher's voice called from inside, breaking the spell. "Are you two planning to stand out there all day? Come in before you catch your death." Vaughn smiled ruefully. "We'd better obey. Mrs. Fletcher runs this place with an iron fist in a velvet glove." Inside, they found the kitchen warm and inviting, with something savory simmering on the stove. Mrs. Fletcher tutted over their damp clothing, insisting they change before sitting down to lunch. When Rose returned to the kitchen in dry clothes, she found Vaughn already seated at the table, his hair still damp from the rain. He looked up when she entered, his smile warming his eyes in a way that made her heart skip. "Perfect timing," Mrs. Fletcher declared, setting bowls of hearty stew before them. "Nothing better than hot stew on a cold, rainy day." As they ate, The conversation turned to Rose's eventual departure. "The stage runs through Willow Creek every Tuesday and Friday," Mrs. Fletcher explained. "Once this weather clears, Vaughn can take you into town." Rose nodded, trying to ignore the pang of regret at the thought of leaving. "That would be very kind." "No trouble at all," Vaughn assured her, though his eyes held a hint of the same regret she felt. "Though there's no rush, you're welcome to stay as long as you need." "I wouldn't want to impose," Rose said hesitantly. "Impose?" Mrs. Fletcher scoffed. "It's a pleasure having another woman around the place. Besides, you're earning your keep with that bread-making talent of yours." Rose laughed, warmed by the acceptance in the older woman's tone. "If bread is all it takes, I could stay indefinitely." "We'd have no objections," Vaughn said quietly, his eyes meeting hers across the table. Something in his gaze made Rose's breath catch. There was a seriousness there, an intent that went beyond mere hospitality. Before she could respond, however, the kitchen door burst open, admitting a rain-soaked ranch hand. "Boss," the man said urgently, "creek's rising fast. Jenkins says we need to move the cattle from the lower pasture before they're trapped." Vaughn was on his feet immediately. "Get the men together." "I'll be right there." As the ranch hand disappeared back into the rain, Vaughn turned to Rose, his expression apologetic. "Duty calls." "Of course," she said, understanding. "Be careful out there." "Always am," he assured her with a small smile. "Save me some stew for when I get back." "I'll keep it warm," Mrs. Fletcher promised. "Now go before those cattle float away." After Vaughn left, Rose helped Mrs. Fletcher clean up from lunch, then moved to the sitting room where she could watch the storm through the windows. The rain showed no signs of abating, falling in sheets that obscured the outbuildings and transformed the yard into a muddy lake. "I hope they'll be all right out there," she said anxiously as Mrs. Fletcher joined her, bringing cups of hot tea. "Vaughn knows what he's doing," the housekeeper assured her. "He's been handling ranch emergencies since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. His father made sure he could manage any crisis." "You've known him a long time?" Rose asked, curling her hands around the warm teacup. Mrs. Fletcher nodded, her expression softening with memory. "Since he was born. I worked for his parents from the beginning, helped raise him and his sister after their mother passed." "What happened to her?" Rose asked gently. "Influenza," Mrs. Fletcher said with a sigh. "Swept through the territory when Vaughn was just 10. His sister was 8. Took their mother and nearly took their father too. Hard times those were." "I'm sorry," Rose said, thinking of her own mother's death and the void it had left in her life. "It's difficult to lose a parent so young." Mrs. Fletcher studied her with shrewd eyes. "You speak from experience." Rose nodded. "My mother died when I was 12. Consumption." "And your father recently," Mrs. Fletcher recalled. "No wonder you have that sadness behind your eyes sometimes." Rose was startled by the observation. No one in Boston had ever commented on her sadness, though it had been her constant companion for years. "Does it show so clearly?" she asked. "Only to those who know what to look for," Mrs. Fletcher said kindly. "Loss leaves its mark always, but it doesn't have to define you." "I'm trying to ensure it doesn't," Rose said quietly. "That's partly why I left Boston. Too many ghosts there." Mrs. Fletcher nodded understanding. "Fresh starts can be powerful medicine. When Mr. Fletcher passed, it'll be 15 years this October. I thought I'd never find joy again. But Vaughn's father offered me this position, and slowly, I built a new life. Different but good in its own way." The simple wisdom in the older woman's words resonated with Rose. Perhaps that was what she was searching for, not escape, but transformation. A life different from what she'd known, but good in its own way. The afternoon passed slowly, the storm continuing unabated. Rose tried to focus on her book, but found her attention repeatedly drawn to the windows, watching for Vaughn's return. The worry she felt surprised her with its intensity. In just a few days, this man had become important to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. It was nearly dusk when the kitchen door finally opened, admitting Vaughn and several of his men, all soaked to the skin and mud splattered but triumphant. "Cattle are safe," Vaughn announced as he removed his dripping hat. "Got them all to higher ground before the creek overflowed its banks." Relief flooded through Rose at the sight of him, tired but unharmed. "Thank goodness," she said fervently. Vaughn's eyes sought hers, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. "Were you worried about me, Miss Rose?" "About the cattle, of course," she replied primly, though her eyes betrayed her with a smile of their own. Mrs. Fletcher shooed the ranch hands off to the bunkhouse to change into dry clothes, then pointed Vaughn toward the stairs. "You too. I won't have you dripping all over my clean floors. Dinner in 30 minutes. Once Vaughn had gone upstairs, Mrs. Fletcher turned to Rose with a knowing look. "You care for him," she observed matter-of-factly. Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's been very kind to me." "It's more than that," the older woman said gently, "and he feels the same way about you." "How could he?" Rose protested. "He barely knows me," Mrs. Fletcher snorted softly. "Sometimes it doesn't take long to know what matters. I knew Mr. Fletcher was the one for me the day I met him, and we had 60 good years together." "But I'm leaving," Rose reminded her, "continuing to California." "Are you?" Mrs. Fletcher asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or is that just the plan you made before life intervened?" Before Rose could respond, Vaughn returned, freshly changed, his hair still damp from washing. The sight of him made her heart skip in a way that answered Mrs. Fletcher's question more eloquently than words ever could. Dinner that evening was a lively affair, with the ranch hands joining them at the long kitchen table, regaling Rose with tales of their adventure moving the cattle through the rising waters. Their easy camaraderie, the way they finished each other's sentences and laughed at inside jokes, spoke of a closeness that Rose had never experienced in Boston's formal dining rooms. After the meal, the men returned to the bunkhouse, leaving Rose, Vaughn, and Mrs. Fletcher sitting around the kitchen table with cups of coffee. The storm had abated somewhat, though rain still pattered against the windows. "Creek's as high as I've ever seen it," Vaughn said, looking tired but satisfied. "Road to town will be washed out for at least a day or two." "So I won't be able to leave for California," Rose said, surprised by the relief she felt at the news. "Not immediately," Vaughn agreed, his eyes meeting hers briefly. "I hope that's not too great an inconvenience." "Not at all," Rose assured him, perhaps too quickly. "I'm in no particular hurry." Mrs. Fletcher looked between them with a smile that she quickly hid behind her coffee cup. "Well, I'm for bed," she announced, rising from the table. "These old bones need rest after all the excitement today." After she'd gone, Rose and Vaughn sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, listening to the rain. Then Vaughn spoke, his voice quiet but intent. "I'm glad you can't leave yet," he admitted. "These past few days with you here, they've been good, Rose." The simple honesty in his words touched her deeply. "They've been good for me too," she said softly. "Better than good. I felt more alive here than I can remember feeling in years." Vaughn's eyes, when they met hers, held a warmth that made her breath catch. "Is California still what you want?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications. Rose found herself considering, truly considering, for the first time since her arrival. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "When I left Boston, all I knew was what I was running from, not what I was running to. California was just somewhere far away, somewhere I might disappear." "And now?" Vaughn prompted gently. Rose looked at him, this man who had rescued her, welcomed her, shown her a life so different from her own, yet somehow more authentic than anything she'd known. "Now I'm wondering if running away is even the right approach," she said slowly. "If perhaps I should be running toward something instead." Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes the right path finds you instead of the other way around." "Is that what happened to you?" Rose asked. "With the ranch, in a way," Vaughn acknowledged. "I always knew I'd take over from my father someday, but I had wild ideas when I was younger. Thought about heading to California myself, or up to Alaska for the gold rush." He smiled ruefully. "But when my father got sick, I realized this land was in my blood. Couldn't imagine being anywhere else." "You were fortunate," Rose observed, "to have such clarity." "I was," Vaughn agreed. "But clarity can come in unexpected moments, Rose. Sometimes all it takes is seeing something or someone that makes everything else fall into place." The intensity in his gaze as he spoke made Rose's heart race. Was he suggesting what she thought he was? That she could be that clarity for him, as he was increasingly becoming for her? Before she could find the courage to ask, a crash of thunder shook the house, making them both jump. The momentary tension broken, Vaughn stood, stretching his tired muscles. "Should get some rest," he said, though his eyes lingered on her face. "Tomorrow will be busy assessing the storm damage." "Of course," Rose agreed, rising as well. "Good night, Vaughn." "Good night, Rose," he replied softly. Then, in a gesture that seemed almost involuntary, he reached out and briefly touched her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Sleep well." The simple contact sent a shiver through Rose that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. As she made her way to her bedroom, she found herself wondering if perhaps the greatest storm was the one brewing within her own heart. The next morning, Rose woke to sunshine streaming through her window, the storm having passed in the night. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, finding the kitchen empty except for Mrs. Fletcher, who was already busy at the stove. "Good morning, dear," the housekeeper greeted her. "Vaughn and the men left at dawn to check the damage. Creeks receded some, but there's plenty of cleanup to do." "Is there anything I can help with?" Rose asked, accepting a cup of coffee gratefully. Mrs. Fletcher considered this. "As a matter of fact, there is. I need to inventory our preserves, see what we'll need to put up before winter. Extra hands would make it go faster." Rose spent the morning in the cool cellar beneath the house, helping Mrs. Fletcher count jars of preserved fruits, vegetables, and meats. The older woman explained the ranch's system of food preservation, how they prepared for the long Montana winters when fresh food was scarce. "Vaughn's father built this cellar extra large," Mrs. Fletcher explained, gesturing to the extensive shelving that lined the walls. "Said a man who doesn't prepare for winter doesn't deserve to see spring." "It's impressive," Rose said sincerely, marveling at the hundreds of jars neatly arranged by type and date. "In Boston, we simply send the housekeeper to the market each day." Mrs. Fletcher chuckled. "No markets out here, dear. What you don't grow or raise yourself, you do without." As they worked, Mrs. Fletcher shared stories of previous winters on the ranch, blizzards that lasted weeks, times when they'd been completely cut off from town for a month or more. The year a late spring frost had killed their entire garden, and they'd had to replant everything. "Sounds difficult," Rose observed, trying to imagine such isolation. "It can be," Mrs. Fletcher agreed, "but there's satisfaction in it too, knowing you've prepared well, that you can take care of your own no matter what comes." Your own. The phrase resonated with Rose. In Boston, she'd had a family by blood and a wide social circle, yet she'd never truly felt she belonged to anyone or that anyone belonged to her. Here, She was witnessing a different kind of family, one forged by shared work and mutual respect rather than mere obligation. By midday, they'd completed the inventory, and Mrs. Fletcher declared they'd need to put up more peaches and corn before winter. "The orchard's heavy with fruit this year," she noted with satisfaction. "We'll start canning next week, once the men have the storm damage under control." Rose found herself oddly excited by the prospect of learning another practical skill, then remembered she wouldn't be here next week. The thought brought an unexpected pang of regret. After lunch, Rose helped Mrs. Fletcher with the bread for dinner, taking pride in how much more confident her movements were already becoming. The dough felt familiar under her hands now, and she found deep satisfaction in the simple, rhythmic process of kneading and shaping. They were just sliding the loaves into the oven when hoofbeats outside announced Vaughn's return. Rose felt her heart quicken at the sound, a reaction she could no longer pretend was merely gratitude or friendship. Vaughn entered the kitchen, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His face was tired but relaxed, his expression brightening when he saw Rose at the stove. "Baking again?" he asked, smiling. Rose nodded, suddenly shy under his approving gaze. "Mrs. Fletcher says I'm improving." "High praise indeed," Vaughn said, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Fletcher handed him. "How was your morning?" "Productive," Rose replied. "We inventoried the cellar. Mrs. Fletcher says you'll need more peaches and corn for winter." "She's probably right," Vaughn agreed. She usually is about such things. "And how are things outside?" Mrs. Fletcher asked, practical as always. "Much damage," Vaughn sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Some fencing down where the creek overflowed, a few small washouts on the roads, nothing we can't fix in a few days." He turned to Rose. "Which means the road to town should be passable by Friday if you still want to catch the stage." There was a question in his eyes that went beyond the practical matter of transportation. Rose hesitated, suddenly uncertain. I suppose that would be best," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Something flickered in Vaughn's expression, disappointment perhaps, before he nodded. "Of course, I'll take you in myself." An awkward silence fell, broken only when Mrs. Fletcher announced she needed to check on something in the garden, a transparent excuse to leave them alone that neither chose to acknowledge. Once she'd gone, Vaughn moved to the window, gazing out at his land. "It's beautiful after a rain," he observed. "Everything washed clean, the grass greener, the air fresher." Rose joined him, keeping a careful distance between them. "It is beautiful," she agreed softly. "I've never seen anything quite like it." "California will be different," Vaughn said, still looking outward. "Grander in some ways, I suppose, the ocean, the mountains, the big cities." "Yes," Rose agreed, though the prospect no longer held the appeal it once had. "Different." Vaughn turned to her then, his eyes serious. "Rose," before he could continue, the kitchen door opened again, admitting Hank, his expression grave. "Boss, we've got trouble," he said without preamble. "Sullivan's men are back, and they've brought Sullivan with them this time. They're at the north boundary, demanding to speak with you." Vaughn's expression hardened. "How many?" "Sullivan and 6 men, all armed." Vaughn nodded grimly. "Get the men together, I'll be right there." After Hank left, Vaughn turned back to Rose, apology in his eyes. "I have to deal with this." "I understand," she said, though fear clutched at her heart. "Be careful, Vaughn, please." He reached out, briefly touching her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I will," he promised. "We'll finish our conversation when I return." After he'd gone, Rose paced the kitchen anxiously, unable to settle to any task. Mrs. Fletcher returned from the garden, her face creasing with concern when Rose explained the situation. "That's Sullivan," she muttered darkly. Nothing but trouble since he moved in 2 years ago. And now bringing armed men to confront Vaughn on his own land. Is there anything we can do? Rose asked, hating the feeling of helplessness. Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. Just wait and pray, dear. Vaughn knows how to handle himself. But as the afternoon wore on with no word from the men, Rose's anxiety grew. She tried to help Mrs. Fletcher prepare dinner, but found herself constantly drawn to the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of Vaughn's return. It was nearly dusk when they finally heard horses approaching. Rose rushed to the porch, her heart in her throat, relieved beyond measure when she saw Vaughn dismounting, apparently unharmed. The other ranch hands were with him, their expressions grim but satisfied. What happened? Rose asked as Vaughn climbed the porch steps. Sullivan tried to claim the creek belongs on his land, not ours, Vaughn explained, his voice tired. Brought surveyor's reports he claims prove it, but our deed is clear the water rights have been part of the Triple Z since my father bought the original parcel. Was there violence? Rose asked hesitantly. Vaughn shook his head. No, thankfully. When Sullivan realized we weren't backing down and that we outnumbered his men, he retreated, said he'd be back with the law on his side. He managed a small smile. Little does he know I've already filed complaints with both the territorial marshal and the land office about his repeated trespassing. Relief washed over Rose. So it's over. For now, Vaughn said, not sugarcoating the situation. Sullivan's desperate, and desperate men don't give up easily. But we've got right on our side, and that counts for something in Montana territory. As they went inside for dinner, Rose noticed Vaughn wincing slightly as he removed his coat. You're hurt, she said, alarmed. It's nothing, Vaughn assured her. Just pulled a muscle helping the men repair some fencing yesterday. But when he reached for the breadbasket at dinner, she saw him wince again, and after the meal, she confronted him privately. Let me see your shoulder, she insisted. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned she has liniment for muscle strains. Vaughn looked ready to protest, then sighed in resignation. All right, doctor, he said with a small smile. Mrs. Fletcher produced a bottle of strong-smelling liniment and left them alone in the sitting room, with pointed instructions for Rose to make sure he actually uses it, because he's as stubborn as his father was about admitting when he's hurt. Vaughn removed his shirt somewhat awkwardly, revealing an impressive bruise spreading across his right shoulder and upper back. Rose gasped softly. Vaughn, that's not nothing. He had the grace to look sheepish. Got caught between a panicked steer and a fence post yesterday. Looks worse than it feels. Rose doubted that, given how he'd been favoring the arm all evening. Sit down, she instructed, indicating the chair by the fire. Let me help. As Vaughn sat, Rose poured some of the liniment into her palm, then hesitated, suddenly aware of the intimacy of what she was about to do. In Boston, such physical contact between an unmarried man and woman would be scandalous beyond measure. But this wasn't Boston, and Vaughn was injured because he'd been protecting his land and his people. Taking a deep breath, Rose began to gently massage the liniment into his bruised shoulder. Vaughn tensed initially at her touch, then gradually relaxed as the medicine began to work its magic, easing the tight muscles. Rose worked carefully around the worst of the bruising, her touch gentle but firm enough to be effective. You're good at this, Vaughn murmured, his eyes closed. I used to do this for my father, Rose explained softly. He suffered from rheumatism in his later years. The doctors prescribed all manner of expensive treatments, but simple massage often helped him most. He was fortunate to have you, Vaughn said. Rose's hand stilled momentarily. I'm not sure he saw it that way. To him, I was primarily an asset to be managed, marriageable property to be used for business advantage. Vaughn turned slightly, catching her eye. Then he was a fool, he said simply, to not see your true worth. The words, spoken with such conviction, brought unexpected tears to Rose's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, focusing on completing her task. When she'd finished, Vaughn rotated his shoulder experimentally, his expression showing pleasant surprise. "That's much better," he said, reaching for his shirt. "Thank you, Rose." "You're welcome," she replied, stepping back to give him space to dress. "Just be careful with it for a few days. Mrs. Fletcher says the liniment works best with repeated applications." "Does that mean you're volunteering your services again tomorrow?" Vaughn asked, a teasing light in his eyes. Rose felt her cheeks warm. "If needed," she managed to say with dignity, though her heart was racing at the prospect. Once Vaughn had his shirt back on, they settled by the fire, the evening having turned cool after the storm. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "You never finished what you were going to say earlier," Rose ventured finally. "Before Hank came in with news about Sullivan." Vaughn studied her face in the firelight, his expression suddenly serious. "No, I didn't." He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, and Rose waited, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. "Rose," he began finally, "I know we've only known each other a short time, but these past few days with you here, they've changed something for me." Rose held her breath, afraid to hope yet unable to stop herself. "I understand you have plans," Vaughn continued. "California, your cousin, starting a new life, and I would never presume to interfere with that." He paused, then added softly, "Unless you wanted me to." "What are you saying, Vaughn?" Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "I'm saying that if you wanted to stay here at the Triple Z, I would be more than happy about that." Rose's heart seemed to stop, then restart at double speed. "Stay? As what?" Vaughn smiled slightly. "Well, Mrs. Fletcher does seem impressed with your bread-making skills." Rose gave him a look that made him chuckle, then grow serious again. "As whatever you want, Rose," he said honestly. "As our guest for as long as you need. As a friend. As—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "as more if that's something you might consider." The plain declaration, devoid of flowery language or elaborate protestations, touched Rose deeply. In Boston, courtship was a game of strategy and social positioning. This was something entirely different, direct, honest, real. "Vaughn," she began, her voice not entirely steady, "I'm not sure what to say. I never expected. When I left Boston, I never imagined." "I know," he said gently. "And I'm not asking for an answer now. You've been through a lot. You deserve time to think, to be sure of what you want." He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I just wanted you to know that you have options, that there's a place for you here if you want it." Rose looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused from honest work, hers smaller and softer but already showing signs of the new skills she was learning. The contrast seemed emblematic of their different backgrounds, yet somehow they fit together perfectly. "Thank you," she said finally, meeting his eyes, "for giving me something I've never really had before." "What's that?" Vaughn asked softly. "A choice," Rose replied simply. "A real choice based on what I want, not what others expect of me." Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need," he said. "The stage runs every Tuesday and Friday, or not at all if that's what you decide." The weight of the decision before her was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in her life, Rose's path wasn't being determined by her father's will or society's expectations. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. That night, sleep eluded Rose as she pondered Vaughn's words, "Stay at the Triple Z." The idea was both thrilling and frightening. She barely knew this place, these people. And yet, in just a few short days, she'd felt more at home here than she ever had in Boston. Was it merely the contrast with her former life that made the ranch seem so appealing? Or was it something to do with the man whose quiet strength and integrity had begun to occupy her thoughts more and more? Rose turned restlessly in her bed, watching moonlight filter through the simple curtains. If she stayed, what would her role be? Vaughn had been deliberately vague about that, offering her options rather than presuming to define her place. The respect inherent in that approach touched her deeply. But what did she want? Did she want to be a rancher's wife, facing the hardships and uncertainties of life in Montana territory? Did she have what it took to thrive in this environment so different from everything she'd known? And what of Vaughn himself? Her feelings for him were undeniable, growing stronger with each day that passed. But was it too soon to trust those feelings? Too soon to build a life around them? Questions swirled in her mind until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Rising early, Rose dressed and made her way to the kitchen, finding it empty. On impulse, she started the coffee and began gathering ingredients for bread, finding comfort in the familiar process she'd learned just days ago. By the time Mrs. Fletcher appeared, Rose had dough rising and coffee brewed. "Well now," the housekeeper said, pleased surprise in her voice. "Looks like you've got the hang of things." Rose smiled, grateful for the simple approval. "I couldn't sleep, so I thought I might as well be useful." Mrs. Fletcher studied her face with knowing eyes. "Lots on your mind, I expect." "Yes," Rose admitted. "Vaughn asked me to consider staying." "Did he now?" Mrs. Fletcher's expression revealed nothing of whether this was news to her. "And what are you thinking?" Rose sighed, punching down the risen dough perhaps more forcefully than necessary. "I'm thinking that I barely know him or this place, that staying would be impulsive, possibly foolish." "But," Mrs. Fletcher prompted gently, "but I've never felt as alive as I have these past few days," Rose confessed. "As if I've been sleepwalking through life until now." Mrs. Fletcher nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Some decisions look impulsive from the outside but feel inevitable from within. When I agreed to marry Mr. Fletcher after knowing him just 3 weeks, my family thought I'd lost my mind. But I knew." She tapped her chest just over her heart. "In here I knew." "How?" Rose asked, genuinely curious. "How could you be so certain?" Mrs. Fletcher considered this. "It wasn't one big thing. It was 100 little ones. The way he always made sure I had the warmest spot by the fire, how he listened when I spoke, really listened. The fact that I could be completely myself with him, no pretending." She smiled at the memory. "And of course, the way my heart seemed to recognize him, as if it had been waiting for him all along." Rose thought about Vaughn, his quiet strength, his evident passion for his land, the respect with which he treated everyone around him. The way he'd rescued her without question, offered her shelter without expectation, given her choices without pressure. "I think I understand," she said softly. Mrs. Fletcher patted her hand. "Whatever you decide, dear, make sure it's what you want, not what you think you should want. Life's too short for should." The wisdom in those simple words resonated with Rose. Her entire life in Boston had been governed by should. She should marry well, should maintain the family's social position, should behave as befitted her station. What if, just once, she made a decision based solely on what she truly wanted? Vaughn joined them for breakfast, his greeting warm but respectful, making no reference to their conversation of the previous evening. Rose appreciated the space he was giving her, the lack of pressure to decide immediately. After the meal, Vaughn mentioned he needed to ride to the north pasture to check on repairs to the fence damaged in the confrontation with Sullivan's men. "Would you like to come along?" he asked Rose. The day promises to be fine, and Daisy could use the exercise. Rose accepted gladly, eager for another chance to explore the ranch and, perhaps, to continue their conversation in the privacy that horseback riding afforded. As they rode out under a clear blue sky, Rose felt a sense of freedom that still amazed her after the constraints of her Boston life. Here, on the back of a horse with the vast Montana landscape spread before her, she could breathe, could think, could imagine possibilities that would have seemed absurd just a week ago. "Penny for your thoughts," Vaughn said as they crested a small rise, pulling their horses to a stop to admire the view. Rose smiled, looking out over the ranch land that stretched to the distant mountains. "I was thinking how different this is from Boston, how much bigger everything feels here." "Bigger?" Vaughn asked, curious. "Not just the landscape, though that's certainly true," Rose tried to explain, "but the possibilities. In Boston, my life was laid out for me, the boundaries clearly defined. Here, it feels like anything could happen." Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's what my father loved about Montana. Said a man could reinvent himself out here, become whoever he truly wanted to be." "Or a woman?" Rose asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Especially a woman," Vaughn agreed seriously. "The women out here are the strongest people I know. They have to be to survive and thrive in these conditions." "Like Mrs. Fletcher," Rose observed. "Exactly like Mrs. Fletcher," Vaughn agreed with affection. "Lost her husband but picked herself up and became the backbone of our ranch. Nothing happens at the Triple Z without her approval, and that's just how it should be." They continued riding, checking the repaired fencing along the creek that marked the northern boundary of Vaughn's property. The water had receded to normal levels after the storm, flowing clear and swift between grassy banks. "It's beautiful," Rose said, watching the sunlight dance on the water's surface. "And valuable," Vaughn added pragmatically. "This creek makes the Triple Z what it is. Without reliable water, ranching in this territory would be impossible." "Is that why this Sullivan person wants it so badly?" Vaughn nodded grimly. "His land is higher, drier. In good years he manages fine. But when drought comes, as it did last summer, his cattle suffer while ours stay healthy. Makes him bitter, I suppose." "Couldn't you share the water somehow?" Rose asked. "Work out an arrangement." "I've offered," Vaughn said, surprising her. "Proposed he could have access at designated times in exchange for respecting our boundaries and contributing to maintenance of the water flow." He shook his head. "Sullivan refused, said he wouldn't take charity, that the water should be his by right." "Pride," Rose murmured, understanding all too well. She'd seen similar stubbornness in her father's business dealings. "Foolish pride," Vaughn agreed, "but dangerous too. A desperate man with wounded pride is capable of almost anything." The warning in his tone made Rose shiver despite the warm day. "Do you think he might try something drastic?" Vaughn's expression was grave. "I hope not, but I've doubled the men patrolling the boundaries just in case. And I've telegraphed the territorial marshal again, requesting he intervene before things escalate further." They continued their ride, the conversation turning to lighter topics: the new foals born that spring, the harvest prospects for the hay fields, the upcoming county fair where Vaughn hoped to show some of his prize cattle. As they returned to the ranch in the early afternoon, Rose found herself more confused than ever. Everything about this place, this life, appealed to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The honesty of the work, the clear purpose, the strong sense of community among the ranch hands and neighbors. And Vaughn himself, his quiet strength, his evident passion for his land, the respect with which he treated everyone around him. The way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wouldn't notice, with a warmth that made her heart beat faster. But was that enough to base such a momentous decision on? To abandon her plans, her independence, for a life so different from anything she'd known? That evening, after dinner, Rose found herself once again on the porch with Vaughn, watching as the sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and gold. The beauty of it still took her breath away, so different from the limited horizons of Boston. "Tomorrow's Friday," Vaughn said quietly, breaking a comfortable silence. "Stage comes through Willow Creek around noon." "Yes," Rose acknowledged, her heart suddenly racing. The moment of decision was upon her, ready or not. "If you want to catch it," Vaughn continued, his voice carefully neutral, "we'd need to leave here by mid-morning." Rose nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The weight of the choice before her seemed almost crushing. Vaughn turned to her then, his expression serious but gentle. "Rose, I meant what I said last night. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. If you need more time, the stage runs again on Tuesday. And if you decide to go to California after all, I'll wish you well and mean it." He paused, then added softly, "But I hope you'll stay." Rose looked at him, this man who had rescued her from an abandoned wagon just days ago, yet who now seemed as familiar to her as if she'd known him all her life. "Vaughn," she began, her voice not entirely steady, "I barely know you or this place. Staying would be impulsive, possibly foolish." "Possibly," he agreed, not arguing the point. "Or possibly not." Rose smiled despite herself. "Mrs. Fletcher said something similar this morning, that some decisions look impulsive from the outside but feel inevitable from within." "Mrs. Fletcher is a wise woman," Vaughn said, a smile touching his eyes, "and has been happily sharing her wisdom with me all day, I might add." "Oh?" Rose asked, curious. Vaughn confirmed. "She informed me that if I let you get on that stage tomorrow without making my feelings absolutely clear, she'd consider it grounds for dismissal after 20 years of service." Rose laughed, the tension breaking slightly. "And what feelings might those be, Mr. Zachariah?" Vaughn turned to face her fully, all humor gone from his expression. "That I've fallen in love with you, Rose Lockhart. That I know it's fast and probably makes no sense, but there it is." He took a deep breath. "That I want you to stay, not just for a while, but for good. That I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." The simple, direct declaration took Rose's breath away. There was no flowery language, no elaborate protestations of the sort she'd heard from suitors in Boston. Just honest emotion, plainly stated. "I don't expect an answer now," Vaughn continued when she remained silent. "It's a lot to take in, I know. And if you need time, weeks, months even to be sure, I'll wait. Just think about it, please." Rose looked out at the vast Montana landscape, painted in the fading light of sunset, then back at this man who had offered her not just shelter, but a future. "I don't need more time," she said softly. "I think I've known since that first morning when you found me in the wagon and whispered that I was safe." Vaughn's eyes widened slightly, hope dawning in them. "Known what, Rose?" "That I was exactly where I was meant to be," she replied simply. "That running away from Boston was really running towards something I didn't even know I was seeking." "And what was that?" Vaughn asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A place where I could be myself," Rose said. "A life with real purpose. And—" she took a deep breath. "A man I could love freely without constraint or calculation." Vaughn's face transformed with joy. "Are you saying you'll stay?" "I'm saying I'll stay," Rose confirmed, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. "That I want to learn about this land, this life. That I want to see if what I'm feeling for you is as real and lasting as I believe it to be." Vaughn reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "It's real for me, Rose, more real than anything I've ever known." "Then show me," she whispered, stepping closer to him. Vaughn's other hand came up to cradle her face, his touch reverent as he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that was both question and answer. Rose responded with a certainty that surprised her, her arms sliding around his neck as she leaned into him, into this moment, into this choice that suddenly felt not impulsive at all, but inevitable. When they finally parted, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I found you in that wagon," he admitted. Rose smiled, her heart full to bursting. "I might have let you even then," she confessed. "You looked like something out of one of my adventure novels, the hero come to rescue the damsel in distress." Vaughn laughed softly. "Hardly a hero, just a rancher who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "My hero," Rose insisted, reaching up to touch his face, still marveling that she had the right to do so. "And I'm staying, Vaughn, not just for now, but for as long as you'll have me." The joy that blazed in his eyes at her words was answer enough, but he said it anyway, his voice rough with emotion. "That would be forever, Rose Lockhart, not a day less." Their lips met again in a kiss that sealed the promise between them. As the last light of day faded from the Montana sky, and the first stars began to appear overhead. 6 months later, Rose stood at the kitchen window of the Triple Z ranch house, watching as Vaughn and his men drove a herd of cattle toward the winter pasture. Snow dusted the distant mountains, harbinger of the season to come, but the valley still basked in the golden light of late autumn. So much had changed since that fateful day when she'd fled Boston, seeking freedom from a future not of her choosing. She'd found that freedom, and so much more, in this vast Montana landscape, and in the love of the man who had found her sheltering in an abandoned wagon. Their wedding had been simple but joyous, held in the Willow Creek Church with Mrs. Fletcher beaming proudly from the front pew and Vaughn's sister Emma, having traveled from Helena with her husband and children to welcome Rose into the family. Rose had worn a dress of ivory silk that Emma had helped her select during a shopping trip to Helena, with her mother's cameo at her throat, the one piece of her Boston life she'd chosen to keep. "Looking at my handsome husband again," Mrs. Fletcher teased, coming to stand beside Rose at the window. Rose smiled, not denying it. "Can you blame me?" the older woman chuckled. "Not a bit. He's a fine man, made finer by having you at his side these past months." It was true, Rose reflected. She and Vaughn had grown together, each bringing out the best in the other. His steady strength had given her the confidence to embrace this new life fully, while her fresh perspective had brought innovations to ranch operations that had improved their prospects considerably. The confrontation with Sullivan had eventually been resolved through legal channels, with the territorial marshal confirming the Triple ZTK's water rights and warning Sullivan against further encroachment. Rose's suggestion of offering Sullivan a formal water-sharing agreement with proper documentation and fair compensation had finally penetrated the man's pride, leading to an arrangement that benefited both ranches while preventing further conflict. "Those peach preserves you put up are a marvel," Mrs. Fletcher commented, changing the subject as she returned to the stove where dinner simmered. "Vaughn had 2 helpings with breakfast this morning." Rose glowed with pride. From bread making, she had graduated to canning and preserving under Mrs. Fletcher's tutelage, discovering a talent for creating conserves and jellies that had become favorites not just at the Triple Z but throughout the community. Her rose hip jelly had won first prize at the county fair, much to her astonishment and delight. "I thought we might give jars as Christmas gifts this year," Rose suggested. "The blackberry jam especially. Everyone seemed to love it." "Excellent idea," Mrs. Fletcher approved. "Though you'd best put some aside for Vaughn. That man would eat at morning, noon, and night if we let him." Rose laughed, her heart full of contentment. This life, so different from what she'd known in Boston, had become more precious to her than she could have imagined. The work was hard, the challenges real, but the satisfaction immeasurable. She'd written to her cousin in San Francisco, explaining her change in plans. The response had been supportive and included an invitation to visit whenever they could make the journey. Perhaps next summer, Rose thought, they might take that trip a proper honeymoon, delayed by the demands of ranch life but no less anticipated for the wait. A letter had also come, eventually, from her stepmother in Boston. Cold and formal, it informed Rose that her scandalous behavior had resulted in her being formally disinherited, cut off from the Lockhart fortune and family connections. Rose had read it with a strange detachment, realizing that the Boston world that had once been her entire existence now seemed as distant and irrelevant as a half-remembered dream. Her real life was here now in this land, with these people, with the man who had whispered, "You're safe now," and made it true in ways beyond the merely physical. As if summoned by her thoughts, Vaughn appeared in the yard, dismounting from Thunder with the easy grace that still made her heart skip. He looked up at the window, spotting her watching, and his face broke into a smile that warmed her from the inside out. Rose waved, then turned from the window to meet him at the door. 6 months of marriage had not dimmed the thrill she felt at his return, no matter how brief the separation. "Welcome home," she said as he entered, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door, a simple gesture that symbolized everything she loved about this life they were building together. Vaughn's arms came around her, drawing her close for a kiss that tasted of fresh air and promises kept. "Best part of my day," he murmured against her lips, "coming home to you." Mrs. Fletcher made a show of focusing intently on her cooking, though Rose caught the satisfied smile on the older woman's face as she turned away to give them privacy. "How are the cattle settling into the winter pasture?" Rose asked as they moved toward the sitting room, Vaughn's arm still around her waist. "Well enough," he replied, "though Diego thinks we should move the pregnant heifers to the south field where there's more shelter from the north wind." "He's probably right," Rose agreed. "Remember how the McAllisters lost 3 calves to exposure in that early blizzard last year?" Vaughn nodded, pride evident in his expression. In just 6 months, Rose had absorbed an impressive amount of knowledge about ranch operations, her quick mind and practical nature making her a true partner in the business as well as in life. "I was thinking the same," he said. "We'll move them tomorrow, weather permitting." They settled by the fire, the warmth welcome as the autumn evening turned cool. Rose curled against Vaughn's side, content in a way she'd never thought possible during her Boston life. "Any regrets?" Vaughn asked softly, as he sometimes did, not from insecurity, but from a genuine desire to ensure her happiness. Rose considered the question seriously, as she always did. Her life here was not without challenges. The work was hard, the isolation sometimes difficult, the Montana winters harsh in ways Boston had never prepared her for. But against those challenges stood the profound satisfaction of meaningful work, the deep connections she'd formed with Vaughn and the ranch community, and a love that grew stronger with each passing day. "Not a single one," she replied honestly, lifting her face for his kiss. "Fleeing Boston was the best decision I ever made because it led me here, to this place, to you." Vaughn's arms tightened around her, his expression tender in the firelight. "And finding you in that abandoned wagon was the luckiest moment of my life. When I whispered that you were safe, I had no idea I was really telling myself that I'd finally found home." As their lips met again, Rose knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be, not in Boston's gilded parlors or San Francisco's bustling streets, but here in the vast Montana wilderness, in the arms of the man who had seen her true worth from the very beginning. She had fled as an heiress seeking escape. She had found, instead, a heritage far richer than anything she'd left behind, a legacy of love, purpose, and belonging that no fortune could ever match. The abandoned wagon that had sheltered her that fateful night stood still on the edge of the property. Vaughn had offered to have it brought in and restored, but Rose had asked that it remain where it was, a monument to endings that became beginnings, to wrong turns that led exactly where she was meant to go. Sometimes, on clear days, they would ride out to it together, picnic in its shelter, and marvel at how a simple structure of weathered wood had changed the course of their lives forever. And Rose would remember that moment when a stranger's shadow had fallen across her hiding place, and a deep voice had whispered words that had proven more prophetic than either of them could have known. "You're safe now. Safe and home at last."